Uh, no, the Arab world has seen many political upheavals since colonialism, since European colonialism has set a very big shock to the Arab society who's been living in basically medieval ways for centuries. This shock has been even greater because colonial powers, European powers, entered these Arab countries with extreme violence. Mainly, first maybe the first example was Napoleon in Egypt, and then the French in Algeria. Since then, insurrections and resistance has never stopped. Periodically, all over the Arab world against the French or the British or the Italians. Maybe the most notable are Amir Abdel Qadir in Algeria, who led several movements of resistance up before being completely defeated and exiled to Syria. Maybe to the British, most known are the Arabi resistance movement in Egypt, and the movement in Sudan in the 19th century, led by the Mahdi. It's called, I think it's called here in Britain, the crazy mullah, of course using a prejudice. And it's known that the Mahdi in Sudan has inflicted many defeats to the British before, again being faced by overwhelming force and being completely defeated and captured. There were movements of resistance in Yemen, Oman, and then later on in the 19th century, there's big importance to the real first Palestinian Intifada in 36 and 39 against the British, which was faced, which is very important, by both the British and the first Zionists in Palestine, which led to maybe the death of around 20,000 Palestinians and the complete disarmament of the Palestinian population. This evolved to more and more movements, which culminated maybe in the 40s and 50s by a large mass movement in Egypt, and then later on to the Iraqi revolution in 1958 to 1963, and maybe these two movements have set the path to the end of colonialism in the Arab world, ending with Algeria in 1962, with a very large mass movement as well. So maybe the countries where the mass movements have been very important, maybe more important than the elitist guerrilla resistance, like in Tunisia or Syria. In Algeria, Egypt, and Iraq, the mass movements have been very important and could have been and had maybe much larger revolutionary potential. It's very important to understand why all of this degenerated later for 40 years, and I like to think that the current revolution has set the end of the old era from independence to the current Arab Spring, and potentially starting a completely new age. So these 40 years since independence, from the 1960s or actually 50 years to 2011, it's very important to understand the dynamics of two big movements, to understand why it led to the failure and legacy of a betrayed revolution, the revolution against colonialism. These two movements are Arab nationalism and and the Arab left, the communists, as in Stalinists. First, the Arab movement, the Arab nationalism has been very linked to colonialism. What happened is that the colonial powers have educated few elites, mainly for administration and for the army. And in most Arab countries, these elites have led Arab nationalism. So most of the coups that happened in Egypt, led by Abdel Nasser, in Syria or Iraq or Gaddafi, was done by colonels, not very high-ranking officers, which is quite interesting. It is as well a middle-class movement. It has been extremely elitist, and in the end, only reproduced colonial way of governing, the same administration. It took some countries really 30 or 40 years to change the laws or the language of the administration. And it has sought from the very start to marginalize the mass and decided to do the revolution in the name of the masses. But in the end, these were just military coups. It gave birth in the end to very rigid, autocratic and bureaucratic regimes, which degenerated to what we see right now, 50 years later. On the other side, the communist parties in most of the Arab countries were founded after the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, and the leaders were mainly handpicked by Moscow and sought only to slavishly follow their orders, and made many mistakes which completely separated them from the masses. In many countries, they even refused to struggle for independence, considering that independence from France, for example, in the case of the Tunisian Communist Party, was not a priority. And they used very theoretical slogans like Tunisian working class should unite with the French working class, which in theory, we won't oppose that, but in practice, we know there was such a difference between the Tunisian and the French. Tunisian had no nationality, had no papers, and apart from a small elite, was almost a slave to the French administration. And the second mistake, which they did not see, is that colonizing these countries was not helping at all the French working class, on the contrary. Another very obvious mistake was, of course, under the order of Stalin, obviously, was to recognize the partition of Palestine and to recognize Zionism as a progressive force in the Middle East. And this, the effect of this was to separate these communist parties from the masses. Another very important mistake, which is actually more like a suicide, was to support the coups that were made by these colonels, like Nasser. The Egyptian Communist Party supported Nasser and called the coup of these officers, they considered it to be a revolution. In Iraq, the Communist Party has misdirected the revolution of 58-63 into accommodating the Arab nationalists, which after giving way to the Ba'ath Party has executed most of the Iraqi communists. In Egypt, Nasser was less bloody with the communists, but put many of them in jail for many years. So not only the actions of the communist parties in the Arab world has misdirected the revolutionary energy of the masses, but as well led to their own destruction. Now, after 20 or 25 years of fall of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Club, it looks like this new revolutionary movement has much more potential to develop into a genuinely mass movement. Of course, even this revolution can be betrayed, and there are many risks and dangers that we should be aware of. One of them is obviously the military, like in Egypt, can completely hijack the revolution. In Algeria, it looks like the military managed to at least put some brakes on the movement. In Libya, it's another big danger, which is foreign intervention. And in Tunisia, some people will think that the Islamists can hijack this revolution and take power and potentially install another type of dictatorship, like what happened in Iran. First of all, I would like to say something about Tunisia, because I just came back, and maybe my opinion will be of interest to you. I'm not that pessimistic. I've been there. I've been there when during the elections, and then I came back again for 3 weeks. Yes, the Islamists and Nahda, they got 40% of the seats in the Constituent Assembly. They got only around 35-37% of the vote, and that's only 13% of elected, because the participation was quite low. It has been much higher within middle class, much lower level of participation within the working class. So the Tunisians did not vote massively for the Islamists. That's the first point. We should recognize that they won. They are the first by far. I think the second party has 15% of seats. But the Tunisians did not vote massively for the Islamists, like what happened in Iran after the revolution. The second point is that it's not an Islamist vote. It's more a conservative vote. I've met many people. Every time I take a taxi in Tunisia, I discuss politics and ask him who he voted for, and 90% of taxi drivers will tell you they voted another, despite that they drink alcohol every day. And everyone has a different explanation for this contradiction, which is not very relevant to this discussion. But it's not a proof that this is not an Islamist vote, but it's just like an anecdote. So it's mainly a conservative vote. Many Tunisians have discovered free speech for the first time after the fall of Ben Ali. This free speech honestly has been very badly used sometimes, discussing really irrelevant topics. There has been lots of the left, the classic left in Tunisia, who did not get more than like 5%, has focused on secularism, on in a way that is very distant to to the average Tunisian or to the working class, and did not at all link their debate to economics and to the social demands, and did not focus on the main demands. Let's remember the first slogan of the Tunisian revolution was work is a right, you bunch of thieves. It rhymes much better in Tunisian Arabic, but this is what it means. And then, so when the Tunisian revolution started, it was mainly focused on the right to work, the right for good living, and then started to become political, asking for the removal of the dictator. Another point, some people see this as the victory of Islamists. I see it more as a victory of a front that was opposing dictatorship, because the three parties who won almost 70% of elections are the Islamists, and then two other secular center-left parties, and they were all in a coalition that was founded the 18th of October 2009 to oppose Ben Ali. All other parties who did not get involved in this fight in opposing Ben Ali and were more or less like trying to play politics, get some subsidies from Ben Ali, but portraying themselves as opposition, they got completely destroyed in these elections. They got 1%, 2%, or 3% each. So the people went to vote massively against the old regime. The Islamists benefit most, but this doesn't mean that they won or that they will win next elections. I've been there in Tunisia, and when I voted for the first time in my life, honestly, I cried. I've seen many people queuing from 7 a.m. till very late, till closure at 8 p.m. Many old people, many young people. It was like a real party, and people were there to punish the old regime. All the parties, there were 80 parties which came from the old ruling party. They got 2 seats. So for me, this is the positive part. Now, coming back to the threat of the Islamists, yes, they can be a threat because inherently they are very close to the nationalists in their politics. And here I'm going to use a phrase from our Algerian friends. That in French they say, "Le fils vient du père." Fils is the Front Islamique du Salut, which is the Islamist party, which is pronounced like the son. And they say the son comes from the father, which is the Front National de Libération, the National Front of Liberation. Because many of the leaders of the Islamist party were were part of the National Front of Liberation. They were on the right-wing side of it. They were more religious, fundamental, and they used the same way of organizing, and they will definitely reproduce the same system and potentially the same mistakes. So, in this equation, compared to the first betrayed revolution of the 60s, we have the Islamists that would play quite a similar role to the nationalists. On the other side, I think I'm much more optimistic with the new left in the Arab world, mainly in Tunisia and in Egypt. It is much more involved in the mass movement. It's very active. It's staging demonstrations every day and actions every day in Tunisia. The following one will be tomorrow in front of the Constituent Assembly, asking to resume live broadcast, which went on for 2 days and then got shut because it was too subversive, showing many infights within the assembly. The other demand is to keep a secular constitution, to keep all the rights that were granted to women unchallenged. One of them to ask formally the Islamists to say formally now that they will not change the constitution and reintroduce polygamy, and as well to grant economic rights in the constitution. That's it.